The morning sun glinted off the sold sign as I pulled into the driveway of my very first home. After 7 years on the force and finally earning that promotion to detective, I had achieved what felt impossible on a public servant's salary. A modest 3-bedroom in Oakwood Estates with actual crown molding and a backyard big enough for a grill. I sat in my car for a full minute, just staring at the red brick facade, barely believing it was mine. The real estate agent had gushed about the neighborhood during the showing. Immaculate landscaping, low crime rates, and property values that only moved in one direction. Perfect for a police officer looking for a safe place to put down roots. What she mentioned with less enthusiasm was the Homeowners Association and its rather extensive rule book. I spent that first morning moving boxes from my rental truck to the living room, sweating through my department t-shirt, but too happy to care. The cherry hardwood floors gleamed in the sunlight streaming through spotless windows. Each trip from truck to house reinforced what all those double shifts and overtime hours had been for. The sharp knock on my front door came just after noon. I opened it to find a woman in her 50s with bottle blonde hair styled in what I would later learn was called a country club bob. Her smile was practiced, professional, but never reached her eyes, which were busy scanning my moving boxes and possibly judging the quality of my furniture. "Welcome to Oakwood Estates," she said, extending a hand with perfectly manicured nails. "I am Corinne Williams, president of the HOA. I like to personally welcome all new residents and provide them with our community guidelines." She handed me a 3-inch binder that weighed more than my service weapon. The cover read, "Oakwood Estates Community Standards and Regulations," in gold embossed lettering. "That explains everything from approved exterior paint colors to lawn maintenance schedules," Corinne explained. "We pride ourselves on maintaining certain standards here. It keeps property values high and undesirable elements out." Something in her tone made me pause, but I chalked it up to standard HOA procedure. I had dealt with far more intimidating people in my line of work. "Thank you. I will be sure to review it," I said, accepting the binder. Her eyes lingered on a box labeled Police Academy graduation photos. Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, you work in law enforcement." "Yes, county police. Just made detective last month," I replied with a hint of pride. "Well, we appreciate civil servants," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Just remember that even those who enforce the laws must follow the rules." She gestured to the binder. "All the rules." As she turned to leave, she added one final comment that would later seem like the first shot across the bow. "We expect all residents to keep the neighborhood respectable. I trust you understand the importance of that." That evening, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and takeout pizza, I flipped through the massive binder. Rules for trash can placement. Rules for holiday decorations. Rules for the acceptable height of grass. Rules for everything imaginable and many things I had never considered needing regulation. I pushed the binder aside and pulled out my phone. It was time to plan a proper housewarming party. After years of cramped apartment living, I wanted to celebrate this milestone with the people who had supported me through academy and beyond, my fellow officers. I had no idea this simple decision would ignite a suburban war. The honeymoon period of homeownership lasted exactly 4 days before the first violation notice appeared on my door. A bright yellow paper trapped under my doormat informed me that my garbage can had been visible from the street for 15 minutes beyond the allowed window of 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. on collection day. The fine was $25. I read the notice twice, convinced it must be some kind of welcome prank from my colleagues. When I realized it was genuine, I laughed it off and wrote a check, dropping it in the HOA payment box that same day. A simple misunderstanding, nothing more. 3 days later, a second notice appeared. This one cited unauthorized mailbox paint shade. Apparently, the previous owner had used oakwood cream when the currently approved color was sunrise beige. The difference was imperceptible to my eye, but the violation carried a $50 fine and a requirement to repaint within 7 days. That weekend, I spotted Karen walking the neighborhood with her clipboard and decided to address the situation directly. I approached her with a friendly wave and my most professional demeanor, the same one I used to diffuse tense situations on the job. "Good morning, Mrs. Williams. I wanted to discuss these notices I have been receiving," I said, holding up the yellow papers. Karen looked up from her clipboard with that same tight smile. "Yes, we take community standards very seriously here. The previous owners let several things slide, and we must bring the property back into compliance. I understand maintaining standards, but the mailbox color seems like something the previous owner should have addressed before the sale," I suggested reasonably. "Perhaps this neighborhood is simply too particular for someone with your lifestyle," she replied, glancing pointedly at my weekend attire of jeans and a faded Police Academy t-shirt. Many first-time homeowners struggle to adjust to quality communities. The condescension in her voice reminded me of suspects who believed their social status placed them above questioning. I had encountered this attitude many times in my career, but never expected it from a neighbor. The following week brought notices for an unauthorized garden gnome, left by the previous owners, and unapproved window treatments, because my blinds were apparently the wrong shade of white. Each time I attempted to discuss these issues with Karen, her responses grew increasingly dismissive. It was during a conversation with Mrs. Chen, my neighbor 3 doors down, that I realized I was not alone in my experience. Mrs. Chen, a retired mathematics professor who had lived in the neighborhood for 15 years, revealed a folder containing dozens of violation notices she had received over the past 3 years. "It started when I planted traditional Chinese vegetables in my backyard garden," she explained as we compared our growing collections of yellow papers. "Before Mrs. Williams became president, no one cared what we grew behind our fences. Now, everything must be pre-approved." Over the next few days, I spoke with other neighbors and discovered a troubling pattern. The Rodriguez family received weekly citations for excessive vehicles when their adult children visited for Sunday dinner. The Patels were fined for offensive cooking odors when preparing traditional meals. Young families and minorities seemed to receive a disproportionate number of violations compared to the retired white couples who comprised most of the HOA board. One evening, while chatting with my neighbor James about the situation, I noticed movement across the street. Karen was standing on the sidewalk opposite my house, photographing my property with a professional camera equipped with a telephoto lens. "She does that regularly," James whispered, looking for violations to document. When Karen noticed us watching, she marched across the street with purpose, clipboard already in hand. She interrupted our conversation without apology. "I noticed your grass is a 1/4 inch above regulation height," she announced, consulting her notes. "And your hose is not properly coiled according to Section 7, Paragraph 4 of the Community Standards." "I will address those concerns tomorrow," I replied evenly. Karen looked between James and me with narrowed eyes. "I should warn you both that troublemakers who band together will find themselves unwelcome in Oakwood Estates. We have ways of dealing with residents who do not fit in." The threat hung in the air as she turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply on the sidewalk. That night, I finalized the plans for my housewarming party. What had started as a simple celebration now felt like a statement. I was not going to be intimidated in my own home. I sent invitations to 25 colleagues from the department, including my sergeant and the precinct captain. This was my home, and I had every right to celebrate it properly. With military precision, I began planning my housewarming party, cross-referencing every detail against the massive HOA rulebook. If Karen wanted compliance, she would get compliance so perfect it would be impossible to find fault. I spent an entire evening creating a parking diagram for guests, calculating exactly how many vehicles could legally park on my driveway and the street without violating any regulations. I measured the decibel levels of my sound system, using equipment borrowed from the department, ensuring it would remain below the 55 decibel limit specified for residential gatherings. I created a spreadsheet listing acceptable hours for outdoor conversation, approved beverage containers, and even the precise distance furniture could be placed from property lines. My invitations to my police department colleagues included specific instructions about parking, noise levels, and the importance of following neighborhood protocols. "Dress casual but professional," I wrote. "This is not just a party. It is a diplomatic mission in hostile territory." Captain Reynolds called after receiving his invitation. "Sounds like you have got yourself a real neighborhood dictator," he chuckled. "Do not worry. We will all be on our best behavior. No one will give her any ammunition." Over coffee at the local diner, my neighbor Elaine filled me in on Karen's history in Oakwood Estates. "She was just a regular board member until 3 years ago," Elaine explained, leaning forward to keep her voice low despite the restaurant noise. "Then she orchestrated this campaign against the previous president, claiming he was too lenient with rule enforcement and causing property values to stagnate." Elaine stirred her coffee nervously. "After she took over, everything changed. The rules did not change on paper, but suddenly they were enforced like martial law. She called code enforcement on the Rodriguez family for their son's birthday party," she whispered. "Claimed they were running an illegal restaurant because the grandmother was cooking traditional food in large quantities." Other stories emerged as I spoke with more neighbors. Karen had reported a family for an unauthorized business when their teenage daughter set up a lemonade stand. She had called animal control on a retired veteran whose service dog exceeded the weight limit for pets. The pattern was clear. Karen wielded the HOA rulebook as a weapon, targeting those she deemed undesirable. Concerned by this escalating pattern, I installed discrete security cameras around my property, ensuring they were compliant with HOA regulations on exterior modifications. The very next morning, the cameras captured Karen measuring my grass with an actual ruler and photographing my flower beds from multiple angles. As the day of the party approached, I made final preparations with almost obsessive attention to detail. Food would be served only in HOA-approved areas. Music would be kept to background levels. Guests would be reminded of the rules upon arrival. Everything would be documented and rule-compliant. The evening before the party, as I arranged the appetizer table and checked my list of approved activities one final time, I heard a knock at the door. No one was there, but a certified letter had been taped to my door frame. The HOA letterhead was prominent at the top of the page. "Notice of unauthorized gathering," the heading read in bold type. The letter went on to deny permission for my large-scale event and threatened daily fines of $200 if I proceeded. It cited obscure bylaws about events likely to disrupt community standards and gatherings exceeding normal residential usage. The letter had been delivered at 8:45 p.m., when the HOA office was already closed for the weekend. The timing felt deliberate, calculated to maximize stress and minimize my ability to respond. There would be no one to contact until Monday, 2 days after my scheduled party. I placed the letter in a folder with all the other notices and documentation I had been collecting. The party would proceed as planned. All of my preparations had ensured compliance with every written rule. If Karen wanted a confrontation, she would find herself facing not just me, but 25 of Riverside County's finest officers. Saturday afternoon arrived with perfect weather, as if the universe itself approved of my gathering. Sunlight filtered through the oak trees lining the street, casting dappled shadows across my freshly mowed lawn. I had been up since dawn, making final preparations and watching for any sign of Karen through my kitchen window. My first guests, Detective Martinez and Officer Washington, arrived precisely at 3 p.m., parking their vehicles with mathematical precision according to my diagram. Both were dressed in neat casual attire, looking more like insurance salesmen than police officers. "Nice place," Martinez commented as I gave them a brief tour. "Very different from that apartment you had near the station." Washington whistled appreciatively at the open floor plan. "Definitely worth all those overtime shifts you pulled." I had barely finished showing them the backyard patio when a sharp knock interrupted us. Through the frosted glass panels flanking my front door, I could make out Karen's distinctive silhouette. I took a deep breath before opening the door. Karen stood on my porch, clipboard clutched like a shield against her chest. Her smile was tighter than a pair of handcuffs, eyes already cataloging everything visible through the open doorway. "I see the unauthorized gathering is proceeding despite official notice," she announced, loud enough for everyone inside to hear. "I just wanted to personally inform you that the HOA will be documenting all violations for the official record." "Good afternoon, Mrs. Williams," I replied calmly. "Please allow me to introduce Detective Martinez and Officer Washington from the County Police Department. They are colleagues from my precinct." Karen glanced briefly at my guests. Her eyes flickered with momentary uncertainty before she recovered her composure. "Even law enforcement must follow community rules," she snapped, making a notation on her clipboard. "Your guests are parked exactly 17 inches from the curb instead of the required 18 inches. "We will address that immediately," Martinez said with professional courtesy, though I could see the corner of his mouth twitching with suppressed amusement. As more guests arrived over the next hour, Karen remained stationed near the edge of my property, documenting each arrival with her camera and clipboard. Captain Reynolds and Sergeant Kelly pulled up in their personal vehicles, both parking with deliberate precision. The gathering proceeded indoors initially, with conversations kept at a reasonable volume and all activities strictly adhering to HOA regulations. Through the windows, I could see Karen growing increasingly agitated as she failed to find clear violations to document. When we moved to the backyard patio for grilling, at the exact hour permitted for outdoor cooking according to HOA guidelines, Karen positioned herself at the edge of her property with a decibel meter in hand. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on my guests, many of whom had dealt with far more intimidating surveillance during actual criminal investigations. "She is more persistent than most stakeouts I have been on," murmured Sergeant Kelly, accepting a plate of perfectly regulation-compliant grilled chicken. Captain Reynolds observed Karen through narrowed eyes. "You know, in 27 years of law enforcement, I have never seen someone so desperately seeking a violation to enforce." As the afternoon progressed, Conversations flowed easily among my colleagues. War stories from the department mixed with advice about homeownership and genuine compliments about my new place. All the while, Karen circled the perimeter of my property like a shark sensing blood in the water. The confrontation we had all been anticipating came when someone laughed particularly loudly at one of the captain's famous fishing stories. Karen immediately marched across the lawn to my patio, decibel meter thrust forward like evidence at a trial. That exceeded the noise limitation by 7 decibels, she declared triumphantly. And this chair, she pointed to one that was perhaps 6 inches over my property line onto the common area grass, is a clear violation of utilization of common areas without proper approval. I stepped forward, maintaining a professional calm honed by years of dealing with difficult situations. Mrs. Williams, I appreciate your dedication to the community standards. If you would like to discuss any concerns, I am happy to address them after my guests have departed. This is not a matter for discussion, Karen replied, voice rising. This is an unauthorized gathering that was explicitly prohibited in writing. Every minute it continues incurs additional fines. Captain Reynolds set down his lemonade and approached, department ID visible on his belt. Ma'am, I can assure you that no city ordinances regarding noise or gathering sizes are being violated here. Perhaps there has been a misunderstanding about the nature of this event. Karen's face flushed with indignation. This is HOA property and HOA rules supersede your authority here, she insisted, though her voice had lost some of its certainty. When it became clear that reasonable discussion would not resolve the situation, Karen positioned herself in the center of my front yard, phone already in hand. This is your final warning before I call the authorities, she announced theatrically, loud enough for the entire street to hear. Several of my colleagues exchanged knowing glances. Captain Reynolds raised an eyebrow as Karen stormed toward her house, phone already pressed to her ear. This should be interesting, he murmured, sipping his lemonade. Dispatch is going to have quite the surprise when they realize who they are being called to remove. The party continued with professional restraint, though an undercurrent of anticipation now flowed through the gathering. Everyone present understood what was coming next. We were all, after all, in the business of responding to calls. 20 minutes later, 3 police cruisers pulled into my cul-de-sac, lights flashing but sirens silent. The response time was impressively quick, though I suspected that had more to do with the address being recognized than the urgency of the complaint. Curious neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the sight of law enforcement vehicles on their quiet street. Karen emerged from her house just as the officers stepped out of their cruisers. She stood on her perfectly manicured lawn, arms crossed with satisfaction, watching expectantly as uniformed officers approached my property. Her expression was one of absolute triumph, the look of someone about to witness justice being served. That triumphant expression froze when Officer Ramirez called out across the lawn, "Hey, detective. Sorry to crash the party. Dispatch recognized your address and thought we should check what is happening." He was grinning broadly, clearly amused by the situation. The blood drained from Karen's face as the responding officers bypassed her completely, instead joining the gathering with friendly handshakes and backslaps. Several were greeted by name by my other guests, creating a reunion atmosphere rather than the law enforcement intervention Karen had clearly anticipated. From my vantage point on the patio, I could see Karen's composure crumbling. This was not following her script. She marched across the lawn toward the officers, clipboard still clutched in her hand like a talisman of authority. "Excuse me," she called sharply. "I am the one who called 911. There is an unauthorized gathering happening here that violates our community standards." I stepped forward and introduced the responding officers to Captain Reynolds, who moved toward Karen with his department ID now fully visible. "Ma'am," he addressed Karen directly, "did you call 911 to report a lawful gathering of police officers?" Karen blinked rapidly, looking from the captain to the gathering of law enforcement professionals now watching her with professional interest. "I called about noise violations and unauthorized use of common areas," she stammered, "and parking violations, and improper gathering permits." Officer Chen, one of the responding patrol officers, addressed her with the patient tone used for explaining legal matters to civilians. "Ma'am, I understand your concern for neighborhood rules, but I need to inform you that no city ordinances regarding noise, parking, or gathering sizes are being violated here. We have conducted a thorough assessment, and everything appears to be in complete compliance with municipal codes." Karen clutched her clipboard tighter, knuckles whitening. "This is not about city ordinances. This is about HOA rules and regulations that all residents agree to follow when purchasing property here. Emergency services misuse is a serious offense," Sergeant Kelly noted, removing a notebook from his pocket with deliberate slowness. "Calling 911 for non-emergency situations can result in citations and fines. It also diverts resources from genuine emergencies." Karen's composure cracked entirely at this suggestion that she might be the one facing consequences. "This is HOA property," she shrieked, waving her clipboard like a battle flag. "I am in charge here. You cannot come into our community and ignore our standards." By now, nearly a dozen neighbors had gathered at a discreet distance, witnessing Karen's meltdown with expressions ranging from shock to what appeared to be satisfaction. Mrs. Chen caught my eye from across the street and gave a small, approving nod. Captain Reynolds maintained his professional demeanor, though I could see the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth that indicated controlled amusement. "Mrs. Williams, is it? Perhaps you could show me the specific HOA rules that are being violated here. As law enforcement officers, we are always interested in understanding local regulations to ensure proper compliance." Karen flipped frantically through her clipboard papers, searching for violations substantial enough to justify her escalation to emergency services. "The grass, the chair, the noise levels." She pointed accusingly at various aspects of my property, none of which constituted anything remotely resembling an emergency. When Captain Reynolds calmly requested to review the specific documentation of these violations, Karen backed away, her certainty visibly crumbling. "I do not have to justify myself to you. I will be calling my attorney. I will have all of your badges for this harassment." With that final threat, she turned and strode back toward her house, the neighbors parting silently to let her pass. The gathered crowd of residents watched her retreat, a general who had led her forces into a battle she could not possibly win. After she had disappeared inside her house, slamming the door loudly enough to violate her own noise regulations, the tension broke. Several neighbors approached tentatively, introducing themselves and offering apologies for the disruption. "She has been getting worse over the past year," explained an elderly gentleman who introduced himself as Mr. Peterson. "Most of us are too intimidated to stand up to her. The fines can be substantial." Back inside my house, my colleagues gathered in the living room, the party atmosphere now mixed with professional assessment of what had just transpired. Officer Ramirez was recounting the dispatch call with barely suppressed laughter. "The dispatcher recognized your address immediately," he explained. When the caller started demanding police intervention for dangerous gathering activities at the home of a detective, they flagged it as a potential situation. That is why 3 units responded. Could she face charges for misuse of emergency services? Asked Martinez, always the one to consider the legal angles. Captain Reynolds shook his head. Not worth the paperwork, but she has been put on notice now. The responding officers documented everything, which should discourage her from trying this particular approach again. As my colleagues discussed the legal implications of false emergency reporting, I found myself processing the public humiliation that was supposed to be mine, not hers. Karen had intended to make an example of me, to show the entire neighborhood what happened to those who defied her authority. Instead, she had exposed the arbitrary nature of her reign to everyone. "You know this is not over," Sergeant Kelly warned quietly, joining me by the window where I was watching Karen's house. "People like that do not back down easily. They just change tactics." He was right, of course. This confrontation had been won, but the neighborhood war was just beginning. What I did not realize yet was how quickly the battlefield would expand beyond just Karen and me. The following week brought an unexpected development. My doorbell began ringing regularly as neighbors arrived with a strange combination of baked goods and documentation, casseroles and complaint files, cookies and correspondence records. Each visitor brought food as a pretext and stories of harassment as the real purpose. Mrs. Chen arrived with almond cookies and a meticulously organized folder containing 3 years of violations notices. "I documented everything," she explained, spreading the papers across my dining room table. "At first I thought it was just me, but then I started talking with other neighbors. The Patels from 2 streets over brought samosas and emails showing Karen had approved a white family's fence proposal, but denied their identical request submitted just 2 weeks later. We appealed to the board," Mr. Patel explained. "But Karen controls the meeting agendas and our appeal was never heard." James, a retired attorney who lived at the corner, arrived with coffee and a folder labeled Potential Class Action. His legal experience had prompted him to begin collecting evidence of what he believed constituted discriminatory enforcement practices. "Selective enforcement of HOA regulations can be challenged legally," he explained, showing me his research, "especially when there appears to be a pattern based on protected characteristics." What began as my personal conflict with Karen had crystallized into something larger, a community finding its voice after years of intimidation. Someone suggested using the HOA's own bylaws to call an emergency meeting, citing a provision that allowed residents to convene if 20% of homeowners signed a petition. Within 3 days, we had signatures from 45% of Oakwood Estates residents. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at the community center. Karen, as HOA president, would be required to attend and respond to community concerns. The night of the meeting arrived with a tension reminiscent of the atmosphere before a major court case. The community center filled with residents I had never met, many clutching folders similar to those that had been brought to my home. Karen sat rigidly in the front row, flanked by 2 other board members who looked distinctly uncomfortable. James, given his legal background, had volunteered to moderate the meeting. He opened by explaining the purpose, to address concerns about HOA rule enforcement and to ensure community standards were being applied fairly and consistently. Karen immediately objected, citing procedural issues with how the meeting had been called, but was overruled when James produced the relevant bylaw section and the certified signatures. One by one, neighbors approached the microphone set up at the front of the room. A woman I had never met spoke first, her voice trembling slightly. Karen threatened to lien my house because my daughter's wheelchair ramp was an unapproved structure, she testified. It took 3 months and a letter from the Department of Justice about ADA compliance before she backed down. Another resident described receiving violation notices for excessive holiday decorations, despite having fewer lights than board members' homes. A young couple detailed being fined for unauthorized landscape modifications after planting native species recommended by the county water conservation program. The HOA treasurer, a retired accountant named David, presented documents showing Karen had been selectively waiving fines for certain residents while aggressively pursuing others. The financial records show a clear pattern, he stated. Discretionary enforcement has been applied inconsistently. Throughout the testimonies, Karen's expression shifted from dismissive to defensive to increasingly alarmed. When James outlined the legal exposure created by discriminatory enforcement patterns, several board members exchanged concerned glances. Individual homeowners can bring claims, James explained to the gathered residents. But when a pattern affects multiple homeowners, particularly those in protected classes, the liability extends to every board member who enabled or ignored the practice. This information appeared to shock several board members, who had perhaps never considered their own legal vulnerability in simply following Karen's lead. The atmosphere shifted from anger to resolution when a silver-haired gentleman rose slowly from his seat in the back row. I recognized him as Mr. Henderson, one of the original homeowners from when the development was first built. "I move for a vote of no confidence in the current president," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "And I further move that we conduct a special election for the position at the next regular meeting." The room fell silent as James asked for a show of hands in favor of the motion. Hands began to raise, hesitantly at first, then with growing certainty as neighbors looked around and saw others joining. Karen's face contorted with the realization that her carefully constructed kingdom was crumbling around her. When the count reached 50 hands and continued climbing, she snatched her purse and stormed toward the exit. "You will regret this," she hissed as she passed my chair, "all of you." But looking around at the united faces of my neighbors, people who had lived in fear of her clipboard and camera for years, I knew the tide had turned. Community had proven stronger than intimidation. The vote continued in Karen's absence, tallying 87-6 in favor of the no-confidence motion. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors lingered, talking openly with each other perhaps for the first time in years. Plans were already forming for the upcoming election, and for reviewing the HOA regulations that had been weaponized for so long. The following morning, Karen's FOR sale sign appeared in her front yard, the ultimate admission of defeat. Several neighbors texted me photos, messages of quiet celebration accompanying each image. The sign represented more than a single person's departure. It symbolized the end of a regime that had divided our community for years. 3 days after the emergency meeting, I received a visit from Howard Griffin, a retired judge who had been appointed interim board president. He stood on my porch with none of the clipboard-wielding authority Karen had displayed, just a simple folder and a thoughtful expression. "We need someone with a sense of fairness and procedure on the new board," he said after we had exchanged pleasantries. "Someone who understands rules but also understands people. Would you consider running for a position in the special election?" My initial reaction was firm resistance. After experiencing the toxic side of HOA politics, the last thing I wanted was to become involved in neighborhood governance. I appreciate the offer, but I think I will pass, I told Howard. He nodded understandingly but left the folder with me. Just look at what we are proposing, he suggested. The board is drafting new guidelines focused on community building rather than punishment. We need voices like yours to make sure we get it right. That evening, I reviewed the documents Howard had left. The draft guidelines emphasized community engagement, reasonable accommodation, and transparent enforcement procedures. There was an entire section on diversity and inclusion that had certainly never appeared in Corinne's rulebook. Most importantly, there were clear checks and balances on board member authority. After a week of consideration, I agreed to run for the open board position. The election was largely ceremonial. Most residents were simply grateful for neighbors willing to serve after witnessing the previous administration's downfall. The following month brought remarkable changes to Oakwood Estates. The Rodriguez family's citation for excessive garden vegetables was formally rescinded with an apology from the board. Mrs. Chen's native plants received environmental recognition rather than violation notices. The community center hosted an inclusion training for all board members. When moving trucks arrived at Corinne's house, few neighbors came to say goodbye. Instead, they were busy preparing for the first annual Oakwood Estates Community Celebration, a block party with proper permits and unanimous board approval. The event would feature food from the diverse cultures represented in our neighborhood, activities for families, and a resource fair for local services. The day of the celebration arrived with perfect early summer weather. Streets had been temporarily closed to traffic, allowing children to play freely without concern. Tables lined the community center parking lot, laden with dishes that represented the heritage of each contributing family. I stood in my driveway watching Mrs. Rodriguez teaching a group of children how to make traditional paper flowers, while Mr. Patel organized a cricket demonstration on the central green. Neighbors chatted across property lines, without measuring the distance between their chairs or worrying about imaginary violations. Captain Reynolds arrived with his family, waving as they approached. "Congratulations, board member," he said with a grin. "Never thought I would see you on the other side of the rule book." "It is temporary," I assured him, "just until we get the new guidelines firmly established." He gestured toward the house across from mine, where moving boxes were being unloaded from a truck. "Did I mention I bought the vacant house? Figured if you found such a great community, it was worth joining. Plus, the price dropped significantly after the previous neighbor listed suddenly." As evening fell on the celebration, I stood watching the community that had transformed in just a few short months. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now shared meals and stories. Children played between houses that had previously been isolated kingdoms. The strings of permitted party lights twinkled overhead like stars. Captain Reynolds raised his glass in my direction from across the cul-de-sac. "To home," he called out. The word resonated differently now, not just a structure that met code requirements, but a place where justice and community had finally aligned. My first home had become exactly what I had dreamed of, not despite the conflict with Corinne, but because of how the community had united in response. In the end, the triumph was not about winning against one difficult person. It was about building something better in the space that opened up once fear had been removed. As I joined my neighbors under the string lights, I realized we had all finally come home.